Hello there makers, it is Jo from Minerva, and today we're going to do a little roundup of some seam finishing. You'll see seam finishing in lots of different videos, people's sew alongs, some of the tutorials that I've done where I've talked about something specific, but today I want to show you 6 seam finishes that you can do without having an overlocker. Having an overlocker is quite an investment, and actually if you're buying one just to finish your raw edges, you really are missing a trick, because you'd want to be buying an overlocker so that you can sew jersey, have different techniques, have different seam finishes on the outside of your garments rather than just making the insides look really nice. Finishing a seam is actually to stop your fabric fraying back from the raw seam edge to your seam line and creating holes in your garments, which means if you can finish the seams accurately and carefully, you will give your clothes a much longer life. This doesn't mean that you need an overlocker. Although you will see all of our makers in videos using an overlocker, that's because we're handling the fabric a lot and we're changing for different shots, and we want to make sure that everything is efficient and we can get through the garment in a really quick fashion. Number 1 is to use pinking shears, and I think they've sort of gone out of fashion a little bit. I don't know why. I suppose people have got an overlocker now maybe, but if you're starting out sewing, then pinking shears are absolutely perfect. They are a little bit tougher on your hands because they're not quite as slick as a pair of dressmaking scissors, but they are quick in another way, which is once you've cut your fabric with your pinking shears, then you've only got to sew the seams. You don't have to go back and treat the seams. If you like vintage sewing, then maybe you're sewing on a vintage sewing machine, then pinking shears are perfect. I made this dress a long time ago. It's from a 1973 pattern. And I've worn it a lot, lots of summers. I've made it in about 2015-16, and I pinking sheared the seams and the fabric, and it's not frayed. Sometimes they go a little bit fuzzy on the edges where it washes, but it will not run back to the seam line. Pinking shears are good if you haven't got much seam allowance left. So if you've sewn with a 1.5 seam allowance and you've used some of that for some fitting ease and you haven't got very much space left, then you can get quite a small seam with your pinking shears, because otherwise you need a little bit of space to use the other methods under your machine foot. But this one, you can get really close to the edge. So don't underestimate the speed of pinking shears. Number 2 is to use a zigzag stitch. Most machines you can switch to a zigzag stitch, which means you can zigzag the edges of your seams. Don't go too close to the edge, otherwise it will sort of chew up the edge, so you need to just come in a little bit. You can also zigzag the 2 seams together and just do 1 row of zigzag, especially if you don't think you can get half under and another half under if you've used some of the seam allowance for fitting. So you can put it together and press it to one side, and you will get a slightly bulkier seam on the right side. Depends what fabric you're using. This is a crepe, so I would suggest you do 2 rows and open the seam out flat. But if you're using another fabric and you zigzag them together and press them to one side and it looks okay, then that means you've only got to do 1 row of zigzag to finish your seams. If you want to move your zigzag on a little bit further and you've got an overcasting foot for your machine, you can get an overcast line, which is sort of the next step up from a zigzag. It just catches the thread over the raw edge and it's pretty quick, and you get quite a neat finish. You might have to just practice on a test piece with your stitch length, but if you want to know more about your overcast foot, you can check out our video here where we will show you how to use an overcasting foot and how to find the right tensions and stitch widths. This is another pattern from the 1960s, a vintage pattern, and I made this probably again in about 2015 or 16. I still wear it, it's still beautiful. It's a really nice soft crepe, and inside I zigzagged all the seams. Around the armhole there I zigzagged the 2 together. Underneath the neck facing, that's all zigzagged together, and it's not fraying at all on the inside, and it's still a beautiful wear on the outside. So don't think that you always need to use an overlocker. Number 3 is to French seam your items. It's quite popular. Some people really like doing it. You have to be quite accurate with your seam allowances, but you'll be sewing your fabric in a different order. So let me show you that on our sewing machine. To create a French seam, you're going to sew your fabric with the wrong sides together. Trim off your extra seam allowance, and then sew the seam again. So from the right side, you just see your single line of stitching, and from the wrong side, you have this little fold of all of the seam allowance. You'll need to make sure that you only use the total amount of seam allowance. So if you had a pattern that has 1.5 centimeters, then you need to make sure that your final line is at 1.5 centimeters. If your pattern only has a centimeter seam allowance, and some indie patterns do, then you need to make sure that you're sewing closer to the edge and trimming off less. So you'll need to work out how much to cut off and where to sew. It's good to try it out on a spare piece, because if you don't, then you'll really alter the overall sizing of your garment. If you would like to know more about French seaming, you can check out our video here. It works particularly well on a sleeve. So if, like that vintage blouse there that I've just shown you, you can French seam that sleeve, and then that would have eliminated having zigzag stitches on the inside. This is what French seams look like on the inside. All of the raw edges are enclosed in a doubly sewn seam. So you sew it once, clip it and trim down some of the excess, and then sew it again. And it makes it really smooth, and you can't see any of the seam finishing. It's really great if you've got chiffon or georgette or anything sheer, if you're sewing lace, anything where you can see the seam allowance through the fabric and you don't want to see either a pinking sheer line or zigzag lines through your fabrics. Number 4 is a seam finish which you would have seen in vintage sewing as well, where you use a straight stitch. So if you're using a sewing machine that doesn't have a zigzag, a real vintage item, and you can just do a really neat straight stitch, then you can use that to finish the seams. The straight turn, or the turn and stitch, is okay. It does finish the edges, but of course you've still really got a raw edge, so it can fray back to your seam finish stitch line and then again to the seam. So it's great if you're making an item that's maybe special occasion and you're not going to wash it on a weekly basis. For a turn and stitch, you sew your seam as normal. You definitely need the correct seam allowance here. It's very hard to do if you've only got a little bit to go at, and you're going to turn just the edge, the raw edge over, and sew it again. And it's a vintage technique, because on a vintage sewing machine you tend to have a really narrow foot and less sort of gubbings all around here of your machine. You've probably got a longer shaft, so it's easier to get at. With a big foot, sometimes it's hard to get right up to the edge of where you want to sew. You need a straight stitch so the raw edge is going towards your original seam line. And it's pretty neat, but as I said before, it probably won't last as long as some other seam finishes, so it's good for something special occasion. So this is, some people call it a straight turn or a turn and stitch, and the raw edge is just underneath that seam allowance. Number 5 is a flat felled seam. You see this on the inside of jeans or trousers because it gives 2 lines of stitching and it makes the inside leg of your trousers really hard wearing. I'll show you that one on the machine because there's just a little turn that you have to do, and it's better if you see it close up. For a run and fell seam, you're going to sew your seam as usual with your 1.5 seam allowance, and you do need 1.5 to ensure that you've got enough fabric to fold over and do the final finish. Once you've sewn your seam, you're then going to trim out half of the seam allowance. Little scissors are fantastic. I went ages without little sewing machine scissors, but they really are a godsend to have by your machine all the time. You're going to fold the longer edge over the raw edge and press that in place. Once you've pressed it in place, you can use a few pins just to stop it popping out. But now you're going to sew close to the edge of that fold. From the right side, you will have one line of stitching showing and your other one is enclosed in here. So from the inside you see 2 lines of stitching. I've got a different colour in my bobbin and my top just so that you can see. And from the right side you get that little seam that can now be seen, and it looks like it's been top stitched. It's really strong because there's 2 lines of stitching holding the seam and the back is all enclosed. Felt seams are really good if you're making jackets, so denim style jackets, the Ilford jacket, any sort of jacket where you want to have the seams showing on the outside as a feature to your design. Number 6, and the most complex of our seam finishes today, is a Hong Kong seam finish. And a Hong Kong seam finish is where you bind the edges of your seam, the raw edges, with a bias binding tape or a straight tape. I mean, if it's on a curve, you're going to need a bias binding, but otherwise you can just fold over either fabric scraps or ready bought bias binding. You see this seam finish on unlined jackets, so that when you have your jacket hanging or if it falls open, you see a nice seam finish on the inside. You can also see it on maybe on the inside of a circle skirt, so any sort of or high-low hem, anywhere where you can get a little peek inside and see your seam finishes. If you want to know how to Hong Kong seam, then you can head over to our video here and I will show you how to do it in that video. It's a really good technique for a long sew, a really slow sew. If you're the kind of person that really likes to have a neat finish on the inside, then you can also use that sort of binding technique like a Hong Kong seam around the facing of an item. So this is my wrap dress and I have a long facing on the inside, and because at the bottom of the skirt can kick out and you can see the inside, then the edge of that has been finished with a bias tape as a Hong Kong finish, but just on one facing piece. You might use a combination of seam finishes on one garment, so you don't have to plump for one, you can switch them in and out. So on this dress I had the pink in Shears, which is how I cut out my fabric. I have zigzagged around the armhole facings because I know the armhole facings are going to stay on the inside. I've done the tape finish on the edge that I think might be seen from the outside. And just here on these side pieces, I have the single turn one, the turn and straight stitch, because I thought that bit's rubbing on my waist, so that might get rubbed more by just the pink and Shears. So you can use a combination of seam finishes on one garment. If you've been watching this video and wondering throughout what is that top she's wearing, this is the Tilly and the Buttons Marnie blouse. It has, there's lots of different options. So if you look at that blouse front cover, which a lot of people do and think that's not the blouse for them, you can change it quite a lot. So this has a ruffle, I chose a ruffle collar, pin tucks, ruffles. I didn't put pin tucks on the arms, and I did take some of the sizing out of the arms, so I made those a little bit smaller, and it's made in a double gauze. I hope you've enjoyed today. It's a little quick roundup, but hopefully it signposts you to further learning if you want to find out a different seam finish for a different type of fabric that you have got. Really, a seam finish will be determined by what machine you've got, what fabric you've got, and which part of the garment you're trying to put the seam finish on. Will it be exposed? Will it be seen? Will it never be seen anyway? So those are the things that will make you choose a particular seam finish. We would love to see what you've been making, overlocker or no overlocker. Do head over to Minerva, make a free account, share your makes, and we would love to see what you've been up to. Do come back again for more sewing tutorials. There are also sew-alongs, fabric pairings, little peeks into new things that are out there in the sewing world. See you soon.